Right, so we're going to talk about the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project, which is a dam which is under construction on the Blue Nile River flowing through Ethiopia and Sudan and into Egypt. And we're going to discuss the environmental risks that this poses to Egypt, because Egypt relies very heavily on water from the dam for agriculture and for drinking, and the construction of the dam on the Blue Nile threatens this supply of water. So Ethiopia believes that the dam will be of great benefit to it because it will allow them to become the greatest exporter of electricity in Africa, and has the potential to make them very wealthy. However, Egypt takes 85% of its water supply from the Nile River, and 60% of this Nile River water supply originates within Ethiopia. Most of Egypt's population is concentrated around the Nile area, um, and because of this fact, the quicker the dam is filled, the more water is withheld from Egypt, due to the dam gates being closed for a longer period of time, restricting the flow through the river. Um, so naturally, Egypt is highly opposed to this project. It worries about the security of its agricultural water supply, um, and Ethiopia is very keen to fill the dam as quickly as possible to ensure that they can begin generating electricity and creating money for themselves as soon as possible. Um, Sudan, in fact, which is the country between Ethiopia and Egypt, through which the Blue Nile runs, is actually supportive of the dam project because they believe that due to the creation of the dam, they'll be able to use the water supply to increase the amount of irrigation to their farmland, which could allow them to increase their number of crop rotations per year. And they also believe that it will reduce the electricity cost, allowing them to benefit from the lower cost of electricity originating from the Ethiopian dam.
So now we're going to talk about some pre-existing security concerns which are at risk of being exacerbated by the creation of the dam. So these are a couple of things that we've discovered through our research, which is well, first one is the risk of military conflict. So the ex-Egyptian president Morsi threatened military escalation on air in 2013, and this is particularly important because he claimed to not have known that this was being televised. So this shows like a private meeting in which he threatened to use military threat. And this just highlights the importance of the issue and the risks, the large risks that are present when dealing with such a vital and important aspect of Egyptian people's well being. And the second thing we're going to talk about is the pre existing border tensions between Sudan and Egypt. And this border tension is about the Halaib Triangle, which no one accounts for currently because it's a very fertile land and thus they're in dispute over who actually owns it. So during this tension, the Sudan withdrew its ambassador from Egypt, and Egypt responded by placing troops in bordering Eritrea in a UAE base, and Sudan thus proceeded to station more troops in the border it shares with Eritrea, and closed the border. And this is at risk of being exacerbated by the creation of the dam if no solution is to be found. And final pre-existing security concern, which is at risk of being exacerbated by the dam, is the strained water supply in Egypt. Egypt already relies heavily on the desalination plants which are in place, and if the dam was to be put in place and not coordinated properly, it would threaten the national water supply if these desalination plants were to fail. In light of the fact that Egypt has been suffering from severe water scarcity in recent years, this is particularly troubling. Uneven water distribution and misuse of water resources, as well as inefficient irrigation techniques, are some of the major factors which are playing havoc within the water security of Egypt. And Egypt has only 20 cubic meters per person of internal renewable freshwater resources. And as a result, the country again relies heavily on the Nile River for its main source of water. It could be said that the Nile River is basically the backbone of Egypt's industrial and agricultural sector, and is the primary source of drinking water for the population. So these are all things that would be at risk of being exacerbated by the dam. So there are also some created human and environmental security issues by the dam. So as stated before, the Egyptian population is heavily reliant on the Nile River, and this puts them at risk of famine as a result of a drought if coordination between Ethiopia and Egypt is not undertaken on the issue of how long the dam would be closed in order for it to be filled. And this is a risk of water insecurity as well as food insecurity. As mentioned previously, that the Egyptian population is heavily concentrated, and the density is heavily concentrated on the Nile. And there's another issue created, which it affects Ethiopia, is that Ethiopia may suffer increased malaria risk as the dam introduces in a large idle body of water, and any seepages or leakages from the dam would thus be malaria breeding grounds. And as you can see, here's a graph showing a study of how at times of increased rainfall in places next to the dam, there seems to be a large risk. At times preceding rainfall, there seems to be a large increase in the risk of malaria spreading, as this creates idle bodies of water. And
So some past attempts have existed to try and solve the environmental issues caused by the dam. These include a collaboration between Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan in the form of the Tripartite National Committee on the Renaissance Dam, or the TNCRD. Um, this is a committee which aims to increase dialogue between the countries with the hope of resolving any concerns each of them has and spreading the benefit between them. The part of this agreement was the 2015 Declaration of Principles Agreement, in which Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan agreed to contract an independent study of the dam's impact and abide by this study in order to decide on a time frame for filling the dam, which can range between 3 years at the minimum, which is of course more along Ethiopia's line, what they would like to see, up to 15 at the minimum. Of course, this is far more beneficial to Egypt because when the dam is filled more slowly, they will have an increased water supply over a long period of time. So we're going to propose a set of possible policies which are in two parts. Those which will mitigate any environmental effects that may be caused should the dam be filled at full speed over a 3-year period, and those which would increase the amount of dialogue between the countries with the aim of resolving the dispute politically. The first set of policies include hydroponics. So hydroponics is a method of farming whereby plants are grown in purely water rather than in soil. And this actually has the benefit that due to the fact that they're grown within greenhouses, there's less water loss and it's more water efficient. So per amount of volume of plant material that you produce, you use less water compared to if you were irrigating an open field. This is a relatively new technology and it's relatively expensive. However, it would do a lot to help mitigate the risk of decreased food supply caused by a reduction in water supply flowing into Egypt. Another policy that we could implement is food imports from nearby countries. So this could be funded by possible compensation from Ethiopia, which could take the form of a percentage of the revenue generated by the electricity sold from the dam. This has the downside that it is again expensive and potentially unsustainable and puts Egypt in a position of risk due to relying on food imports from external countries, and also the fact that Egypt is already a net importer of food products. Another one, which is an existing policy which has been implemented, is desalination. So this is where you take seawater and through a chemical process you remove the salt in order to make it drinkable and useful for irrigating fields. Egypt already relies very heavily on this, and it causes some environmental damage in the form of chemicals and chlorine, and uses a lot of electricity. So this is something that we potentially want to avoid increasing if we can, although it could be used as a worst case scenario if the Egyptian water security is threatened to a large degree. The final policy is the ability to moderate releases from existing Egyptian dams on the Nile. So this includes the Aswan Dam, which is a very large hydroelectric dam on the Egyptian Nile. if the releases of water from this dam can be timed correctly to coincide with the releases of water from the new Renaissance Dam being built in Ethiopia, the Nile could actually withhold water to be used in times of forecasted water shortages in the future. And again, this is something that can be implemented unilaterally and could allow the Egyptians to improve their water security in the long term in collaboration with Ethiopia. So the second set of possible policies would take place within the TNCRD, and this is a political agreement which would allow the three countries to come to a decision on how long the dam is going to remain closed, and therefore how much water will be able to flow into Egypt in the long term. So the first possibility is to create a line of contact between the environment ministers of Egypt and Sudan to coordinate the Aswan and Ethiopian Renaissance dams opening and closing to moderate the water flow into Egypt. The second possibility is that Ethiopia provides compensation to Egypt for the years that the dam is not completely open, which could be used to fund projects such as desalination and food imports. And the third is to implement policies of moderating releases from Egyptian dams and to reduce the dependency on unsustainable agriculture in the long term through research and implementation of hydroponic schemes.
So in light of all this, the recommended policy that we have decided to undertake was a combination of unilateral approaches as well as multilateral agreements. So this would entail a combination of creating a committee to oversee the filling of the dam, as well as policies to mitigate the environmental threat should the committee not come to an agreement or it's not properly implemented, which is basically policy number 2. As the benefits of this is that we've come to the conclusion that a legally binding agreement would be difficult to obtain under the Court of Justice of the African Union and would not be able to be properly implemented, as not all states actually ratified the Court of African Union, and it seems very unrealistic to force upon the other nations an agreement. So instead, through these policies, all three parties actually stand to gain, and thus reasons to comply outweigh the risk of conflict, especially in light of past Egyptian threats. So all three parties stand to gain, as mentioned previously. Sudan could actually benefit from the dam as 2 to 3 crop rotations versus 1 crop rotations, which would provide an increased amount of cheaper energy. Egypt would be compensated for the time the dam is closed, and Ethiopia would be able to build the dam, export its energy, and would not be facing any obstruction or objection from the Egyptian government. So the third benefit from our recommended policy is that through the implementation of the hydroponic schemes, as well as moderating the releases from the Egyptian dams, this would create research opportunities for environmental solutions to be implemented in future troubled regions with water insecurity or food insecurity, as these new technologies, especially hydroponics, reduces the amount of water needed to grow plants and is actually a sustainable agricultural method to use. And finally, the combination of unilateral solutions and trilateral agreements assures Egypt will be ready for a worst-case 3-year scenario, while showing other nations that were willing to cooperate and were willing to better the region as a whole. And in conclusion, this would allow all three parties to gain and would not infringe on anyone's sovereignty, as well as creating future solutions to be implemented in other areas.